Hey there, athletes. Coach John Ferry here. Very excited to sort of welcome you to our Week 6 athlete briefing. Having to do a little pre-record this week, so I'm doing some travel here over the holidays. But very excited to discuss Week 6. I hope everyone is having an amazing Week 5. I'm going to start with a little bit of housekeeping here. My final reminder of this challenge, that as we're coming to the end, I want you to keep going into that portal and checking the box, chasing that 100% completion percentage. It was one of the big goals of this challenge, was to stay consistent with your training from the week of Thanksgiving all the way through the new year. So keep going in, chasing that 100% or as close as possible to that 100% completion percentage. Just a reminder, we have some challenges upcoming. So January 7th, we're kickstarting both our General Fitness Challenge as well as our Half Marathon Challenge, peaking for races on the weekend of March 17th, which is in and around the New York City Half, as well as a race weekend via the extension program, April 27th, 28th, that weekend, which is the Nashville Half, which I know a lot of people are heading down to participate in. Looking very much forward to that already. So signups are open for both programs on the website currently. So go claim your spot. Here in Week 5, we're just continuing to make pushes both in our VO2 max and our threshold energy zone. Super identical structures to previous loading weeks here. So let's go ahead and jump straight into Week 6 because there were a lot of really great questions that I want to touch on. Key workout number 1 of Week 6, our VO2 max interval run. So we're keeping the VO2 max intervals on the schedule. However, we are regressing the workout substantially from the level that you've been at here in the last few weeks. So a very reasonable question, especially coming into the distance test at the end of the week, is why include them at all? Many people are familiar with the taper coming into some of your key workouts. So the reason that we're including them is that we want you to stay sharp in advance of that distance test. Sometimes it's really hard to go and find that pace after you've only run easy for a week or so. So we're including it, but as I mentioned, regressing the overall stress of the workout. So we reduce that stress of the workout by shortening the total length of time of the workout, but in particular, the total length of time at that energy zone. So it's going to be an opportunity to kind of go hit that pace, but for much shorter periods of time than you've done over the last 3 or 4 weeks. Also, something to keep in mind, the shorter the race distance, typically the shorter the taper time. So people, the half marathoners and marathoners of the world are used to sometimes this 1 to 3 week taper time. For a 20-minute distance test, we're really only going to pull off the gas entirely for a couple days leading into it. We are once again reducing the overall training stress, but not removing those paces altogether, because one more time, I want you to stay sharp. Key run number 2, the micro interval run. So this is the exact same idea. These are very short bursts of speed with very lengthy recoveries. So it's going to be kind of your last opportunity to really push pace before the weekend. So the goal here is to stay fresh, but really start to touch on that pace one more time. So this is an opportunity in this workout in particular to maybe test out at very short periods of time the pace that you plan to get to for that 20-minute distance test. So across all levels of runners, people have a hard time finding that pace at the start of a race. I'm sure you've heard it a zillion times from a zillion different runners and friends, etc. They started too fast, they started too slow. Usually it's starting too fast, right? You went out, you overshot, and then it's hard. Even a 20-minute test, it's tough when you overshoot that pace early to self-correct and be able to hold on and make that push. So use this as an opportunity to find that pace. Once again, short periods of time, you find that pace, try to hold it for a very short period, drop down. Try not to overshoot the pace. That's what we want to make sure we avoid in the 20-minute distance test. We also want to avoid that here. It's going to make the workout a little bit too hard, and part of the exercise is just finding that pace that you want to hold for that 20-minute distance test. So that's our micro interval run. And now our kind of finale to our program here is that 20-minute distance test, and then we'll obviously talk about option B, which is repeating that progression run. So, the distance test, got lost in my notes here, 20-minute distance test. The goal here is simple. we want to be a little bit better than week 1. So the test is really nothing more than an opportunity to measure your progress over the last 6 weeks and see if you've made any gains. If that's very exciting to you, then outstanding. It's exciting to me too. Go line up, see if you made some progress, give it a rip. If it's not exciting to you or terrifying to you, don't do it. We'll talk about option B here. So option B is just to repeat the progression run that we did in week 1. So for people who've been around a long time, we test often. We talk a lot about why we test and why performance tests are valuable to kind of constantly make sure you're testing your progress and training in zones that correlate to your current fitness. That being said, you can really do a similar thing, not quite as good, but a similar thing by just comparing similar workouts over the span of a lengthy period of time. So taking that progression run that we did in week 1, repeating it now at the end of week 6, there's a lot of ways that we can quantify progress that aren't strictly the result of that distance test. So we could just simply say, what was the effort like? How was the effort different from week 1 to week 6? Did you feel a little bit better at in week 6 after this tough training? Outstanding. Maybe how did your total distance compare? Do you end up doing more distance over the progression run than you did in week 1? Doesn't necessarily tell us a lot, but it's better than not. Maybe how did heart rate compare? This is another tough one. Depends if you're inside, outside. Heart rate usually takes actually a much longer period of time to change than the 6-week span of our challenge, but maybe worth taking a look. Finally, how did your control of the pacing compare to week 1 to week 6? This would be a really exciting one for me to see, especially if you're kind of new to interval running and pace changes in general. Did you feel like you had more control over your pacing towards the end of this challenge after a 6-week structured workout than you did in week 1? So a lot of different ways to quantify progress over the last 6 weeks outside of the 20-minute distance test. But one more time, 20-minute distance test for those who are excited and want to really go after it. What you're really looking for is just a little bit of progress over the week 1 test that you did 6 weeks ago. So we'll jump straight into some questions because there were some excellent ones that came up this week, as every week. So question 1 here was, I find that all of my paces are attainable or even slightly too easy, but when I run my easy pace, my heart rate seems high or elevated. I know this is not heart rate based training, but I feel like if my heart rate is over 155, then maybe my easy pace isn't actually easy enough. Do I slow down? Do I leave it because every other pace is more attainable? Are there exercises to do while running to keep my heart rate down? So the kind of short answer to all of this is yes, but I'm actually not going to touch on any of that actually. So I would say more so if you're running and you're feeling good and your pace corresponds to what you're kind of calculated from your distance test, don't worry about the heart rate element of it. There definitely is not a magic number that you need to hit. So in this scenario here, being over or under 155 doesn't matter. We are all completely different in terms of our heart rate ranges, and you're going to have to kind of find that for yourself, and I'll talk about that in a second here. But in this exact scenario, I would be much more connected to the feel, the effort, and if all of that is connecting with your running and you're feeling strong there, is focus on that much more than your heart rate number. So the longer answer is if you really want to train via heart rate, you're either going to have to do a field max heart rate or threshold heart rate test to really determine your zones. And you can do a pretty good field test with some data analytics and get some pretty accurate results. Or probably the much better option at that scenario is to get a lab test done, which you'll be able to determine your aerobic and lactate threshold, potentially even your VO2 max. You'll also be able to determine your aerobic and lactate pace zones and heart rate zones to kind of dial in your training, but be really prescriptive about it. And then the final caveat, which many people have heard me say many times, is if you're really putting a lot of emphasis on the heart rate of your training, the risk base is not good enough. We know it's decent, but it's not accurate enough if you're putting so much weight in it. So you're going to have to switch to a chest strap, an armband, something that's going to give you much more accurate data in order to dictate those workouts. Next question here was, should your running cadence be between 170 and 180 beats per minute? Plenty of questions on cadence out there. Kind of the short answer on this, probably ideally it's nice to be between 170 and 180, and the reason I say it's nice is more footfalls per minute means the impact upon the ground is broken up across more footfalls, so it's going to be less impact per footfall with a slightly higher cadence, less ground contact time, etc. However, if you're a perfectly healthy runner with no history of lower leg injuries, no history of repetitive stress injuries, then the last thing I'm going to do is go in and start to tweak and mess with your stride for no reason. And the biggest, probably two main reasons why I wouldn't do it is, one, if you've ever tried to work on cadence or alter your cadence or alter your stride in any way, it's fairly frustrating, difficult, and takes a long time and a lot of patience. So it's a tough thing to start on. The second, maybe even the more important reason, is that whenever we go in and we want to start working and tweaking someone's stride, the thing that comes natural to you, almost always we're giving up short-term efficiency in order to make that change. So once again, for healthy runners, I don't worry too much about it. It doesn't mean that I've never worked with it on athletes, and doesn't mean that I won't do it consistently. And where you would do it is if you did have an athlete with a history of those lower leg injuries, repetitive stress injuries, and a low cadence. It does provide an opportunity to maybe be a healthier, happier, more efficient runner by getting in there and tweaking that cadence. So it would be a decent kind of risk-reward scenario to sacrifice a little bit of that short-term efficiency in order to hopefully make them a healthy, more durable runner for the long time. But finally, if you've been running healthily and having fun doing it and have not had issues, wouldn't get too worried about your cadence there. Our next question here was, as we come into the winter, is there a minimum long run distance you would say for those joining the half challenge? So this is a little bit longer question that I shortened it here because I'm going to broaden it a bit and just say, yes, there is minimum distance of long runs that I like athletes to maintain. And yes, this is a time of year where many runners reduce that distance because they're either moving inside, they don't want to run in the cold outside, they don't have races for a while, etc. So I would say it depends a lot upon your race distance goals, the race distances you've competed in the fall, and also kind of what your usual long run is looking like. So for my, kind of especially advanced marathoners and half marathoners, when they're coming into their off season, I like them to maintain at least a 90-minute long run on the weekend. So the time-based thing, that's going to be a little bit different, right, depending upon your paces. But I like 90 minutes, found as a good standard. However, if your kind of average long run right now is 45 or 60 minutes, you're certainly not going to maintain a 90-minute long run. That's going to be a big escalation. So what I would say, and we'll use the scope of this challenge here. We use 45-minute long runs. We use 60-minute long runs. If I were transitioning into a half marathon program, I would maintain that long run. I probably wouldn't drop off of that peak at all. Maybe in terms of, the way that we kind of periodize our training weeks of 3 weeks of load, 1 week of unload, is work on the higher end of that range for 2 to 3 weeks at a time, and then drop it up back a week, maintain the short end of that load. But for our long distance runners out there, I like 90 minutes to kind of maintain during the off season. If you've been in the 45 to 60 minute range, I would kind of hold where you are and feel comfortable with at the moment, not drop too much beneath that. Next question here was that, do you feel that there is ever a time to intentionally test down? I tend to be a good distance test taker and will push myself to PR, but my current set of paces is actually working me pretty hard. Just wondering if it's best to not test and continue to roll with these questions. So excellent question. I think this probably applies to a lot of people. So in the past, we have talked sometimes about kind of the pros and cons of this 20-minute distance test, but pros and cons of any 20-minute distance test, this would be across multiple sports, etc., which is really strong athlete. Let me rephrase. Athletes with a really strong VO2 max can overperform on the 20-minute distance test. It is a test that really pushes VO2 max in order for us to determine threshold and then breakout paces. So especially really good short distance runners, high VO2 maxes, overperform and then do have a hard time translating those paces to the endurance paces. So if you're being pushed to the max by these paces, especially threshold, we haven't done much half marathon and marathon, but I've talked before, those are pace zones that are at a high percentage of threshold. But if you're being really pushed by threshold, it absolutely would be okay to decide that you want to kind of maintain your pace zones for a little bit longer. You have to think these are relatively short challenges, 6 weeks. This one, when we come into the new year, we'll have the 8-week general fitness, obviously the 10-week half marathon. They become a little bit more substantial. 6 weeks is sort of the minimum amount of time we kind of expect to see change. 8 weeks, a little bit better. 10 weeks, even better still. So if you're if you're feeling kind of really pushed to the brink there, it absolutely is okay just to hold these paces, carry them over for the next challenge that starts. And as discussed earlier, maybe use that progression run as an opportunity just to compare some of those other metrics we discussed that are a little bit more quantifiable based on feel. What I do think is a good note for all here is that progress is not a straight line up. So I expect here coming into the end of next week, we're going to see a lot of excitement and a lot of exciting results from the 20-minute test of people who have improved from week 1. And that's outstanding. But it doesn't always just get better and better and better and better with time. You're going to have great training cycles, you're going to have down training cycles, you're going to have medium training cycles, etc. So it does move around a lot. So there are absolutely peaks, there are 1000% valleys where you're should at some point see yourself coming backwards in order to get stronger and go forwards again. And then there are absolutely going to be holds where, once again, as I mentioned, 6-week challenge, relatively short challenge, maybe haven't made that huge breakthrough yet, especially if you were coming in with kind of some fresh zones to begin with. So 100% okay to hold those paces for a little bit longer until they start feeling a little bit more comfortable, and then kind of go back to that 20-minute test and see how you've advanced at that point. It's a great question there. Then our final question here is, once again, about the 20-minute test. There were a couple questions on the same topic, tried to roll it in together. So question about the 20-minute test, what would you suggest as a target increase in pace versus the first test? If I'm doing it on the treadmill or outside, it's going to be the same here. I've completed all the training and feel like my paces from the first test may be a bit slow, so I know I can do better. Great question. Congratulations in advance. That's an excellent way to come into the end of this challenge here. So I mentioned inside and outside, the advice is going to be the same on this. And remember, as I kind of mentioned the first time we touched on the test there, really the goal is to do just a little bit better than week 1. So while it would be amazing if you do a lot of bit better and just have the 20-minute distance PR, really our goal is just to get a little bit better than week 1. So the awesome thing about having these comparable tests only 6 weeks or 8 weeks apart is that you have that data point from just a few weeks ago. So you can look back and see that exact pace you started at. Did you end up decelerating during the test? Did you end up accelerating during the test? But you have, real world metrics to compare yourself and plan against. So for me, my goal was just to get a little bit better. I probably want to start either at or above the exact same pace I started at last time. If it's me, I probably want to start just a little bit faster than I started last time. I'd probably hold that pace just a little bit ahead of my previous result until the halfway point. And in the second half of the race, and when I say race, I mean our 20-minute test. The second half of that test, I would be looking to see how much I could push myself all the way to the end. And as long as you never fall back to where that previous pace was, you know that you're making progress. So that's how I would do it, is I'd really try to, work and make my plan for this test based upon my week 1 test. And so if you feel like you really can do better, you don't necessarily have to start a lot faster, just start a little bit faster. And once again, at that halfway mark, you can really make some decisions if you feel like you can accelerate ahead again from that point forward. And obviously the last few minutes, certainly kick as hard as you can to the finish. Love to see that anytime it can happen. Otherwise, congratulations on getting to the end of our holiday challenge. As I said, a huge part of this one was just being consistent during this very complicated time. So thank you so much for being part of this, and we sure hope to see you at the top of 2024. Have a great one.